The wash plant sits silent, dead. It's mid-July and the Yukon peak season and Parker Schnabel's Dominion Creek operation is hemorrhaging cash at a rate that would make most men vomit. The sluice runs are empty. The conveyor belts aren't moving. And somewhere in a Portakabin office, a spreadsheet is telling a story that number 31-year-old miner wants to hear. You're failing. The numbers are catastrophic. Parker Schnabel had set an audacious goal for season 15. Mine 10,000 ounces of gold. 10,000. At current gold prices hovering near $2,500 per ounce, that's a $25 million season. That's generational wealth. That's vindication for every risk he'd ever taken since he was a teenager running his grandfather's operation. But reality? Reality is brutal. By mid-season, more than halfway through the narrow, 120-day window that is Yukon mining, Parker has barely cracked 3,000 ounces. He's not just behind schedule. He's drowning. Dominion Creek, the claim he'd poured millions into, the ground he'd staked his reputation on, is turning out to be what veterans call a money pit. Every ton of pay dirt is costing him more to process than it's worth. The math is simple and unforgiving. At this rate, season 15 won't just be his worst performance It'll be a financial disaster that could cripple his operation for years. And here's the twist that makes it even more painful. Gold prices are at near record highs. The market is screaming opportunity. Other miners are having banner seasons. But Parker is watching his competitors pull wealth out of the ground while his own machinery chews through diesel and operating costs, producing barely enough gold to justify running the equipment. His crew knows it. Mitch Blash, his right-hand man and plant operator, can see it in the gold room after every disappointing cleanup. Tyson Lee, who's been with Parker since the beginning, feels the tension radiating off his boss. Chris Dumit, the veteran foreman, has seen mining operations collapse under less pressure than this. The conventional wisdom, this situation is clear. Cut your losses. Shut down underperforming ground. Reduce crew size. Minimize spending. Survive to fight another season. That's what consultants would say. That's what accountants would recommend. That's what any rational person would do when they're losing money. Parker Schnabel has never been interested in what rational people would do. The villain here isn't just bad ground or bad luck. It's the tyranny of the timeline. The Yukon doesn't care about your problems. You get 120 days between spring thaw and fall freeze. That's your window. Miss it, and you're done. The permafrost doesn't negotiate. Winter doesn't grant extensions. And every day that ticks by with those wash plants sitting idle is a day you'll never get back. So while other mining operations are having their normal problems, mechanical breakdowns, equipment failures, the usual drama, Parker is facing something far more existential. The very real possibility that everything he's built, every gamble he's taken since he was 16 years old, might come crashing down because he bet on the wrong dirt. The clock is ticking. The season is slipping away. And conventional mining wisdom says there's only one smart play left: damage control. Parker Schnabel didn't go to mining school. He didn't get an engineering degree. He didn't climb any corporate ladder or apprentice under industry experts beyond his own. Grandfather, what he did do was drop out of college after 2 weeks to take over his grandfather John's mining operation at 16 years old. While his peers were studying for midterms, Parker was learning to read bedrock, manage million-dollar equipment, and make decisions that could bankrupt a family legacy. By his early 20s, he was running one of the most successful independent mining operations in the Klondike. But that success came with a reputation. To the old guard, the veterans who'd been pulling gold out of Yukon creeks since before Parker was born, he was the kid, the young hotshot. The guy who got lucky with good ground and big TV contracts. They respected his work ethic, sure. But there was always that undercurrent. Let's see how he handles real adversity. Season 15 was giving them their answer. And it wasn't pretty. The inciting incident came during what should have been a routine production meeting. Parker gathered his core team, Mitch, Tyson, and Chris, expecting to deliver the news they'd all been dreading. We're shutting down Dominion Creek early. We're consolidating operations. We're cutting our losses." Instead, Parker dropped a bomb that made his foreman physically recoil. "I bought TD oil fields." Silence. The kind of silence that happens when people think they've misheard something. "You did what?" Mitch finally managed. "I just spent $2.5 million to buy Tony DeMauro's company. We now own Gold Run and Sulphur Creek." To understand why this declaration landed like a grenade in that meeting, you need to understand the context. TD Oilfields wasn't just any mining company. It was owned by Tony DeMauro, a Yukon mining veteran with decades of experience and a portfolio of historic claims. Gold Run and Sulphur Creek were legendary names in Klondike mining history, creeks that had produced millions of dollars worth of gold over the past century, but Parker wasn't buying them for their history. He was buying them because he was desperate, and he believed these claims had virgin ground that could save his season. The reaction from his team was immediate and visceral. Chris Dumit, normally unflappable, looked like he'd been gut-punched. They were already stretched impossibly thin trying to make Dominion Creek work, and Parker wanted to open a third operation. In the middle of the season, with the same crew? That's suicide, someone muttered. And from a conventional standpoint, it absolutely was. Mining operations are planned months, sometimes years in advance. You don't just add a new mine site mid-season. The logistics alone are staggering. You need to move equipment, set up infrastructure, test the ground, establish sluice runs, coordinate crew rotations. Each of these tasks normally takes weeks of dedicated focus. Parker was proposing to do all of it simultaneously, while somehow keeping his existing operations running, but here's what his team didn't fully grasp in that moment, what perhaps even Parker didn't fully articulate. He wasn't just making a business decision. He was making a survival decision born from a very specific kind of desperation that only comes when you're watching your entire LAS. Operations circled the drain. Parker had been raised on stories of his grandfather, John Schnabel, who'd spent decades mining the Klondike and had taught Parker that good ground fixes everything. Bad gold counts, bad seasons, bad luck, all of it disappears if you find the right dirt. And Parker believed, with the conviction of someone who'd been reading Yukon geology since he was a child, that Sulphur Creek was that dirt. The personal stakes were enormous. This wasn't just about money. Parker's identity was wrapped up in being a successful miner. He'd built his entire adult life around proving he could not only carry on his grandfather's legacy, but expand it. Failing at 31 years old, failing spectacularly with cameras rolling and a television audience watching, failing at the exact moment when gold prices made success most valuable, that wasn't something Parker could accept, so he'd done what desperate men with conviction do. He'd bet everything on being right. If you, like us, believe that human ingenuity and sheer determination can overcome impossible odds, hit that subscribe button right now. And tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. We want to know where our community of problem solvers is tuning in. The scale of what Parker was proposing didn't fully hit his team until they started mapping out the logistics. Moving a wash plant isn't like moving a truck. These aren't machines you can just hook up and tow down the highway. A wash plant like Parker's Bob unit is a multi-component, multi-ton industrial complex. You've got the main hopper and screening deck, the sluice run infrastructure, the conveyor systems, the water pumps and recirculation equipment. Each component has to be disassembled, transported separately, and then reassembled with precision at the destination. And the destination, in this case, Sulphur Creek, was 25 miles away, through some of the most treacherous mining roads in the Klondike. These aren't paved highways. These are narrow, winding tracks carved into mountainsides. It's often just wide enough for a single vehicle, with drop-offs that can kill you if your trailer slides 6 inches the wrong direction. In summer, they turn into mud bogs that can swallow equipment. They cross creek beds where spring flooding can wash out entire sections overnight. Moving heavy machinery on these roads requires expertise, patience, and a willingness to accept that everything that can go wrong probably will. But Parker had a theory that made the insanity make sense. Sulphur Creek had already been stripped. In mining terminology, stripping is the back-breaking work of removing overburdenal, the worthless dirt, gravel, and vegetation that sits on top of pay dirt. It's the most time-consuming part of opening new ground. Normally, you'd spend weeks, or even months, stripping a new site. Before you can even think about running PE, through your wash plant, Tony DeMaro's crew had already done that work on significant sections of Sulphur Creek. The pay dirt was exposed and ready. Parker's theory was simple. If they could get Bob to Sulphur Creek, they could start producing gold immediately. Not in weeks, not in days. Immediately. The counter-argument from his team was equally simple. Moving Bob would take at least a week, possibly 2. That's a week of zero production from a wash plant that, when running, processes millions of dollars worth of pay dirt per season. The opportunity cost was enormous. Parker's response: "We can't keep running, Dominion. We're losing money every hour those plants run. I'd rather have Bob sitting on a trailer for a week, heading toward good ground than running another day on bad ground." The how of the move became a master class in mining logistics and improvisation. First, they had to partially disassemble Bob at Dominion Creek. The main hopper unit alone weighed approximately 40 tons. They used Parker's largest excavators machines, with buckets that could hold a full-size pickup truck to lift sections of the plant onto custom-built lowboy trailers. Each lift was a delicate operation requiring precision and communication between multiple crew members. The sluice runs, which process the gold-bearing material through a series of riffles and mats that catch the heavy gold particles, had to be completely broken down. These runs are engineered to very specific angles and water flow rates. Take them apart wrong, and you'll spend days getting them dialed back in at the new location. Then came the transport itself. The convoy, multiple lowboy trailers carrying wash plant components, support vehicles, fuel trucks, and crew moved at a crawling pace. On some sections of the route, they averaged barely 5 miles per hour. Radio communication between vehicles was constant, sharp turn coming up in 50 feet. "Everyone, watch your clearance. Creek crossing ahead. Check your trailer connections." At one point, a trailer carrying a major conveyor assembly got stuck in a mud section that had been passable just hours earlier, but had been turned into a quagmire by a brief rain shower. They had to use excavators positioned on solid ground to literally pull the trailer through inch by inch, with the operator watching his machine's stability on the soft edges. When they finally got Bob to Sulphur Creek, reassembly began immediately. This is where Parker's experience showed. He'd moved wash plants before it's part of mining, but never under this kind of time pressure, and never with this much riding on it. Setting up a wash plant is part engineering and part art. The sluice angle has to be perfect. Too steep and gold washes over the riffles. Too shallow and material doesn't flow properly. Water pressure and volume have to be dialed in precisely. The screening deck that separates oversized material has to be adjusted for the specific characteristics of the pay dirt you're processing. Parker's crew worked 16-hour days getting Bob operational. They set up the water recirculation system, which uses pumps to cycle water through the sluice, run critical. In the Yukon, where water licenses are strictly regulated, and you can't just pump unlimited volumes from nearby creeks, they position the main excavator which would feed pay dirt into Bob's hopper and establish the optimal dig pattern. This matters more than casual observers realize. You're not just randomly scooping dirt. You're trying to process the richest pay in the most efficient sequence, balancing gold grade with the volume you can run. Then came the moment of truth, the first test run. They fired up Bob's engine, a diesel power plant that sounds like a freight train when it revs, and started the conveyor belts. Water began flowing through the sluice runs. The excavator operator took his first bucket of sulfur creek pay dirt and dumped it into the hopper. The material flowed down the screening deck, water carrying it through the sluice run, and disappeared into the settling pond at the end. It worked. But working and producing gold are two different things. They wouldn't know if Parker's $2.5 million gamble would pay off until the first clean dash-up in placer mining. A cleanup is when you shut down the wash plant and remove all the material that's been caught in your sluice. Runs hopefully gold, but also black sand and other heavy minerals. You take this concentrated material to your gold room, process it through finer equipment, and see what you've actually recovered. Cleanups are emotional events. Sometimes you pull out more gold than you expected and the whole crew celebrates. Sometimes you pull out less and everyone goes quiet. The weight of a season can pivot on what comes out of those sluice mats. Parker decided to do a cleanup. After just 2 days of running pay through Bob at Sulphur Creek, 2 days. Most operations would run for at least a week before cleaning up, but Parker needed to know if his theory was right. He needed proof that this insane gamble had any chance of working. The crew gathered in the gold room. Mitch operated the cleanup sluice and the fine gold concentrating table. Everyone else watched in near silence as black sand and gold began separating on the table's rippled surface. Gold is hypnotic when you see it in concentration. It doesn't look like jewelry. It looks like what it is: heavy metal that has been weathered out of ancient rock, transported by water and ice, and concentrated by geology over millions of years into the exact spot you're mining. It catches light differently than anything else. Even rough, unprocessed placer gold has a presence. The gold accumulated on the cleanup table, more than anyone expected from just 2 days. Final win: 141.65 ounces. At current gold prices. That was over $350,000 worth of gold from 2 days of operation. Parker's crew hardened. Miners who'd seen good cleanups and bad actually reacted audibly. That's not normal. You could see the math happening in everyone's heads. If this was 2 days, what could a full week produce? What could a full season produce? But Parker knew this was just proof of concept. The real test would be getting Bob fully dialed in and running at maximum efficiency. That would take another week of adjustments and troubleshooting. And then they'd do another cleanup. The cleanup that would truly reveal whether Parker's suicidal. $2.5 million decision was a genius or catastrophic mistake. The resistance to Parker's plan didn't come from government regulators or mining inspectors. It came from something far more insidious: physics, mechanical reality, and the crushing weight of trying to do everything at once. While Bob was being set up at Sulphur Creek, Parker still had to keep his other operations running. This wasn't a situation where he could shut everything down and focus on the new site. He had payroll to meet, equipment payments, land lease costs. Money was flowing out whether gold was flowing in or not. The antagonist in this story is operational chaos. The grinding reality that you cannot be in 3 places at once, and mining operations demand constant attention and decision-making from their leaders. Chris, out. Doomit was trying to keep production going at one site. Mitch was splitting time between locations, trying to keep wash plants operational. Tyson was coordinating crew schedules and equipment sharing between sites. And Parker was driving hundreds of miles per week between operations, troubleshooting, making decisions, and trying to hold together an operation that was fragmenting under the strain. Equipment. Failure is always a problem in mining, became catastrophic under these conditions. When a critical pump failed at Dominion Creek, it meant choosing: do we pull resources from Sulphur Creek to fix it, or do we let Dominion sit idle while we focus on the new ground? These aren't easy calls. Each decision has a dollar value attached to it. Pull the wrong crew member from the wrong location at the wrong time. You've just cost yourself thousands in lost production. The antagonist also manifested in doubt, both internal and external. Parker's decision was being questioned constantly. Mining forums and industry observers were calling it reckless. Even within his own crew, there were moments of serious concern about whether they'd bitten off more than they could chew. "Are we making anything at Dominion Creek?" became a recurring question. The answer was uncomfortable. Barely. But shutting it down completely would mean admitting the ground was worthless. Eating those losses, and potentially dealing with lease and regulatory implications of abandoning a site mid-season. So they kept it limping along while pouring energy into Sulphur Creek. Then came the mechanical crisis that nearly derailed everything. Bob's main drive, belt the critical component that powers the entire conveyor system, began showing signs of wear. In mining, belts fail. It's part of the job. But belt failures on critical equipment can shut you down for days while you source and install a replacement. And in the Yukon, sourcing a replacement might mean flying parts in from Whitehorse or even Fairbanks, Alaska. The belt was deteriorating rapidly under the stress of constant operation. They were running Bob harder than they'd ever run it, processing pay dirt for longer hours per day than the equipment was designed for. Because every hour counted, Mitch spotted the problem during a routine inspection. The belt was fraying on one edge, and small pieces were starting to separate. It might last another 3 days of hard running. It might fail in the next hour. Parker had to make a call. Shut down now for preventative maintenance. Losing precious production time, but avoiding a catastrophic failure. Or push it, hope the belt held, and risk a complete breakdown that could cost them a week or more. He pushed it. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated gambling based on experience. Parker had been running mining equipment since he was a teenager. He'd seen belts fail, and he'd seen belts hold. He believed he could hear the difference in the machines. Operation. Could sense when a component was about to give up, versus when it just needed gentle coaxing to make it through another shift. The belt held. Barely. They got another 40 hours of production before finally doing an emergency belt replacement during a brief weather window when rain had made the pit too soupy to dig anyway. But the real conflict, the true test of weather, Parker's gamble would pay off, came down to something even more unpredictable than mechanical failure: the gold itself. Placer gold distribution is maddeningly inconsistent. You can have incredible gold in one section of a creek and virtually nothing 20 feet away. Ancient stream channels twist and turn underground, and the richest pay often exists in narrow bands that require geological intuition to find. Parker's entire bet was predicated on the belief that Sulphur Creek had rich, consistent pay dirt over a wide area. The 141-ounce cleanup was promising, but it was also just one data point. You can get lucky with a hotspot. The question was, would the gold hold? They spent the next week pushing Bob to its absolute limits, running 20 to 22 hours per day when conditions allowed, processing every yard of pay dirt they could physically dig and transport. Parker was gambling that consistency would give him volume, and volume would give him the numbers he needed to save his season. The crew was exhausted. This wasn't sustainable long-term, and everyone knew it. But they also knew they were in the middle of the one finite season they'd get to make this work. Next year would bring different challenges, different ground, different variables. This opportunity, this specific window with these specific claims, would never exist again by Mine Notice Day. It was time for the big cleanup. The cleanup that would definitively answer whether Parker Schnabel's $2.5 million acquisition was a masterstroke or a disaster. They shut Bob down on a Thursday afternoon. The cleanup would take most of Friday. By Friday evening, they'd know. The gold room has a particular quality of silence before a major cleanup begins. It's anticipation mixed with dread. You've done the work. You've run the pay. You've spent the money and burned the fuel and pushed the equipment to its limits. Now you're about to find out if any of it mattered. Mitch Blaszek started pulling the mats from Bob's sluice run. These mats thick rubber, with carefully designed channels and pockets, are where gold accumulates as thousands of yards of pay dirt wash through the system. When they come out dripping with black sand and gold, it's a good sign. When they come out relatively clean, you've been processing barren ground. These mats were heavy with material. The cleanup process is methodical. You spray off the mats over a cleanup sluice, concentrating all the heavy minerals into a smaller volume. Then you run that concentrate through progressively finer equipment, first a small sluice to remove the larger rocks and lighter material, then onto a gold table where water and vibration separate gold from black sand by density. This particular cleanup was taking longer than usual because there was simply more material to process. That could mean more gold. Or it could just mean more black sand and iron-heavy minerals that mimic gold's behavior in a sluice but are worthless as the concentrating process continued. Gold began to appear, not flakes, not dust, nuggets, pickers. The kind of gold that makes a miner's heart rate spike because it represents ancient, rich pay dirt that hasn't been disturbed since the last ice age. The final weighing took almost 20 minutes because they had to weigh the gold in. Batiste, their largest scale, couldn't handle the total volume at once. Final tally from this Sulphur Creek cleanup, 299.00 ounces, at gold prices hovering around $2,500 per ounce. That was approximately $747,500 worth of gold from roughly 10 days of operation. The reaction in the gold room was a mixture of relief, vindication, and exhaustion. Chris Dumit, who'd called the whole plan suicide weeks earlier, was grinning. Mitch looked physically lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Tyson was already doing mental math on what this meant for their season total. Parker's reaction was more subdued, but you could see it in his posture. The tension that had been living in his shoulders for months had finally released. The math was undeniable. If they could maintain anything close to this production rate at Sulphur Creek while managing baseline production from their other sites, they might actually hit their season goal. They might turn the worst start to a season into one of the most successful finishes in Parker's career. But the vindication went beyond just the gold count. Parker's decision to buy TD Oilfields had been questioned by veterans, doubted by his own crew, and criticized by observers who thought he was overextending. The 299-ounce cleanup was proof that his geological instincts, the same instincts he'd been developing since he was a kid working with his grandfather, were sound. Sulphur Creek continued to produce at a remarkable rate through the rest of the season. The consistency of the pay dirt meant they could run with confidence, knowing that every bucket of material going through Bob had legitimate gold content by season's end. Parker had pulled off what had seemed impossible at mid-season, while he didn't quite hit the 10,000 ounce goal he'd set at the beginning of the year. The Sulphur Creek acquisition had transformed a potential disaster into a successful season. The ground he'd purchased for $2.5 million had paid for itself in its first partial season and would continue to produce for years to come. But the legacy of this decision extends beyond just season 15's gold count. Parker Schnabel had proven something that goes against almost every principle of conventional business management. Sometimes the right move when you're failing isn't to cut back, it's to double down. But that only works if you're doubling down on something real. If you're gambling based on genuine expertise rather than desperation. The difference between Parker's move and simple recklessness was this: he understood the geology. He'd studied the history of Gold Run and Sulphur Creek. He knew what those creeks had produced in the past and had geological reasons to believe there was more. His gamble wasn't a coin flip, it was an informed bet based on decades of mining knowledge, both his own and his grandfather's before him. In the years following season 15, Parker's operation would continue to evolve and expand. But the lesson from the Sulphur Creek acquisition became part of his operational philosophy. Good ground fixes everything. Equipment breaks. Crew problems happen. Weather doesn't cooperate. But if you're standing on the right dirt, you can overcome almost any obstacle. The mining industry noticed. Young miners trying to establish their own operations saw what Parker had done and understood that conventional wisdom isn't always wisdom. Sometimes it's just fear dressed up as prudence. Tony DeMoro, the veteran who'd sold TD Oilfields to Parker, later remarked that selling to Parker was the right decision because he knew the ground would be mined properly. DeMoro had been mining the Yukon for decades and could have tried to work the ground himself, but he recognized that Parker had the crew equipment and drive to maximize the claim's potential. The specific details of the Sulphur Creek operation, the 25-mile wash plant move, the mid-season startup, the immediate production success, became the kind of story that gets told in Dawson, city bars and mining industry gatherings. It's the kind of story that separates the miners who survive from the miners who thrive. Because here's the truth about mining, and about any resource extraction industry. You're always gambling. You're betting on geology you can't see, on equipment that will break, on weather you can't control, and on metal prices you can't predict. The only variable you can control is your own decision-making and your willingness to act when others would hesitate. Parker Schnabel's $2.5 million acquisition wasn't suicidal. It was survival, and sometimes survival requires you to risk everything. You've built on the belief that your expertise and instincts are worth more than the conventional wisdom that says wait or play it safe or cut your losses. The 299-ounce cleanup from Sulphur Creek. It's proof that sometimes the craziest idea in the room is actually the only sane option left. Stories of practical genius like this one happen more often than you'd think. They just don't always make it onto television. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Parker Schnabel's season-saving gamble, subscribe for more stories about the people who bet everything on their expertise and won. And don't forget to drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of problem solvers and risk takers. Until next time.